The culture of work. This from 531 to 536. Work is changing. We go to a type of work which is much more inside than outside. Work is now driven by the clock, not the sun. Work is driven by the market, not the season. People have supervisors, something they may not have been used to while working on the farm. And there's a lot more hierarchy. There's a lot more managers and official positions than what people might have been used to working in agriculture. It's a lot more impersonal. There are more machines. There's now becoming less skilled labor. And employers, the people who actually write the paycheck, are much more removed. And that means there's no connection between employers and their workers. In fact, half of all workers are not in the same county within 10 years because people don't have that connection to a job that they had before in America. To adjust to this changing lifestyle of work, the workers really dictated the pace and the quality of work at first. They found jobs for friends and relatives. They taught new employees how to deal with the workplace. They also created social and fraternal organizations to give their life more meaning and fun outside of the workplace. And some joined unions. And the unions' function early on is to provide companionship. It's to provide job postings. Unions provided insurance, which is important for people who might have gotten injured or even killed on the job. They provided food to struggling families. They had held social events, and they also provided indoctrination into the labor movement. They're the ones who introduce workers, the union introduces workers to this idea of the working class having to work together and stick together and stand up for each other. Most people, although despite all the differences in industrial work compared to agricultural work, most people appreciated the opportunities for better jobs and higher wages. 1/4 of all workers rose to middle-class jobs. And for their children, for subsequent generations, this is even more likely. And it's even true for immigrants. The extreme case of that is this guy here, Andrew Carnegie, who was himself a child of an immigrant family, starting out working class and worked his way up to being one of the richest men in America. But his case is very rare. Most business owners are U.S. born, and most business owners were at least born into the upper middle class, if not the wealthy class. But this opportunity for improvement really tempers and decreases the appeal of unions and radicalism. Unions are weak in the 1800s. They never constitute more than 2% of the labor force. This is because unions are seen as something that's foreign. They are seen as something that's radical. Two things that American workers don't really want to be associated with. Different trades or different industries, different ethnicities, workers from different countries, and other differences really kept the labor force fragmented. We never see a strong unification of the working class. And also, what we were talking about earlier, how mobile workers were, how often people moved around to find different and better jobs. That makes it very hard to organize strong unions if people are always moving. And the employers really strongly opposed labor unions with various methods, which we'll talk about later. And this makes the unions weaker. But as we move closer to a national union, a national economy, we start to see national labor organizations, or what we might even call national unions. The first example is the National Labor Union. created by William Silvis in 1866. And they had rather idealistic goals of like the workers actually owning the businesses. The next national organization that becomes prominent is the Knights of Labor, which started out as a Philadelphia garment workers union in 1868. And it is a secret organization until 1878 when their leader, Terence Powderly, went public with it. And they were very welcoming compared to some of the other organizations we'll talk about. They welcomed women in the workforce to join the union, or their organization. They welcomed 60,000 black workers to join their organization. The only people they excluded were non-producers, bankers, lawyers, liquor dealers, so we're starting to see a little bit of the prohibition influence here, gamblers, but employers could join. This means from early on, the Knights of Labor is not going to be a radical organization, and they're going to really view strikes and anything that stops the labor force and stops profits from being made as really bad. They mostly have lofty utopian goals of workers owning the means of production. But one of the big things that they got behind was supporting an 8-hour workday, and they're also opposed to child labor. The Knights of Labor is going to decline in importance as a result of some failed strikes and then later some violence that they were blamed for, like the Haymarket Square riot, that really leads to the public turning on the Knights of Labor and seeing them as too radical, and they're really done by 1895. The next organization that becomes really important is the American Federation of Labor, and they're created in 1886. And what they are is kind of a loose alliance of smaller craft unions around the nation. So they're only going to have skilled workers in the American Federation of Labor. They're led by Samuel Gompers, who said that he wanted to increase the working man's welfare each year. They are much more practical. They practice what we would call bread and butter unionism. They're not dreaming of workers owning the means of production. They recognize that capitalism with business owners and workers is here to stay, and that the workers are going to stay workers. So they're much more pragmatic in their approach. They want to try to gain things that are going to help the workers. Higher wages, shorter hours, and better working conditions. These are their goals. And they are willing to call a strike or call a boycott to try to reach those goals. But they're only reaching for limited and reasonable gains. If the employers are fair with their workers, the American Federation of Labor says, look, you'll have a stable labor force. We won't go on strike if you treat us fairly and give us fair wages, fair hours, and reasonable working conditions. They also believe that monopolies and trusts are okay as long as they're fair to their workers. They're going to be the most important labor group in the country by the 1890s, and over 1/3 of all the skilled labor in the country will be a member of the AFL before World War I. Now remember, most workers, though, are not in a union, but the AFL is still reasonably powerful. The AFL, however, is going to ignore and really oppose women joining their organization. Only 2 of those smaller unions that join actually allowed women in their union. By 1910, less than 2% of women workers are in unions. So few men are in unions and even fewer women are in unions. They also excluded African Americans by requiring them to pay high initiation fees and even take examinations that discouraged African Americans from joining AFL-affiliated unions. So what happens when labor gets upset? Employers really saw labor as any other resource. They are the same as building materials or raw cotton. Supply and demand determine the price for cotton. Supply and demand should determine the price for wages. regardless of any concern for the welfare of the worker. So labor unions are going to quickly fire union members. This is why union members often kept their membership secret. And business owners are going to be happy to hire what we call scabs. These are replacement workers for unions when unions go on strike. And they'll also use the court injunction, which is when business owners go to the court and the court declares a strike or a boycott illegal and forces workers to go back to work. One of the more important strikes in our nation's history is the Pullman strike in 1894, which is where workers at the Pullman Palace Car Company, which built railroad cars, they went on strike because their wages were cut and some other things that we'll read more about. This strike is broken by an injunction, which banned the union leaders from supporting the strike, and workers were forced to go back to work or face being fired. The Pullman strike, though, was supported by another union, the United Railway Workers Association, and they really stopped all the trains nationwide temporarily in support of the Pullman workers. But we'll read more about this later. The Supreme Court gets involved in labor unions. In the case R.E. Debs in 1895, the R.E. means in matter of, it ruled that injunctions were legal and that the courts and business owners could continue to use them against strikes. In Holden versus Hardy in 1898, it said that business owners could limit the number of hours miners could work because it was dangerous. Now, this might sound good, but it also limited the amount of hours miners could get paid for. In Lochner versus New York, it said that they could not limit bakers' hours, saying that they could sell their labor freely. And employers can make most employees work long hours. That's what comes out of that Lochner decision. In the late 1800s, the U.S. had more labor violence in the world, or in the nation, than any other industrialized nation in the world. From 1880 to 1900, there are more than 23,000 strikes with more than 6.6 million workers going on strike. Another important strike is the Great Railroad Strike of 1877, where 100 workers were killed after railroads nationwide are closed and federal troops, Army soldiers, are used to break up the strike. In 1886, we had the Haymarket Square riot. This is the one that ends the Nights of Labor. There was a meeting held, a workers' meeting. A bomb goes off, killing some police. Police shoot 4 workers. And as a result of the Haymarket Square riot, many Americans link labor with radicalism. And this drastically reduces or weakens the national labor movement. Like we said, it really kills the Knights of Labor. City police forces are strengthened worldwide or nationwide. And in Chicago, they even build 2 military bases real close to the city to help put down any future labor unrest. In 1892, federal troops are sent into Idaho to put down a silver miners' strike. And in 1892 as well, in Homestead, Pennsylvania, Andrew Carnegie and his partner Henry Frick cut the wages of their steel mill workers by 20%. And the local union, Amalgamated Steel and Iron Workers, went on strike, and they surrounded the steel mill. And Frick actually hires a private army of Pinkerton security agents to drive them off. There's an actual battle between Pinkerton agents and union members in the middle of Pennsylvania. They're shooting at each other. 13 people are killed during this strike. The state militia is called in to restore the peace, and the mill is reopened, but the strikers have to give up. And the nation really starts to question, what's the cost of industrialization? And is all of this labor unrest worth it?